Hello, this is C.L. Barber looking at crime and punishment. Today we're going to be looking at the church and changing laws in medieval times. We're hopefully going to be able to explain why the church was important in medieval times, be able to make a judgment as to whether the church helped or hindered justice, and also look at some of the new laws which were created at this time. So, what was the medieval church? Well, in this period, religion was at the top of the feudal system, and it was also very powerful with medieval law. It also controlled people's thoughts and actions, and it helped decide what crime was. In each of the towns and villages, the clergy were the most educated and most respected citizens, and cathedrals were often the largest buildings. These were designed to show God's dominance, his power, and his ability to judge and to protect the people. God was also at the centre of ordeals as discussed previously, such as the ordeal by hot iron, hot water, cold water, and blessed bread. Many people thought that church courts, however, did hinder effective justice, as these trials by ordeal were based on superstition. Church was also really important in influencing change and continuity during this period. So, the medieval church taught that good or bad behaviour would influence if a person went to heaven or hell once they died. The church was also extremely powerful in the fact that it owned 20% of the country's wealth. It also collected the tithe, which was a tax from all villagers. This was 1/10 of their earnings. However, at this time, the growth of Islam in Asia and Africa in the 13th century worried the Christian faith, so during this period it started to become less tolerant. One example of this can be seen in the 1290s, when English Jews were told to convert or to be banished, which means to leave the country. The church made sure that people remained Christians as they were starting to become aware of other religions. One of the things that the church was responsible for was the trial by ordeal. The church's role in trials by ordeal showed its importance in someone being guilty or innocent. However, in 1215, the same year as the Magna Carta, Pope Innocent III ordered that priests should stop helping to organise these trials. As a consequence of this system ended quickly. It had been used when juries couldn't reach a verdict, and it was based on the idea that God would decide a case. Now it would be just trial by jury. This was good, as it was possible that by using trial by ordeal, some guilty men and women had escaped punishment, whilst some innocent people had been punished. Therefore, it had been an unfair system of justice. Benefit of the clergy. This is when any clergy member accused of a crime, no matter how bad, was tried at a church court. However, anyone loosely associated with the church, for example gravediggers, could claim it. This was important because church courts were far more lenient and they were rarely gave the death penalty, sometimes just a verbal apology to the church, and this was seen as incredibly unfair. Anyone could say that they were a member of the church. To stop this, churches used the test. They had to read Psalm 51 from the Bible. As non-churchmen often couldn't read, it meant that only churchmen would be able to be tried in church courts. However, many learned this verse by heart to escape corporal and capital punishment. As a result, it was called the neck verse, as it could literally save your neck from the noose. This system again was unfair and unjust, especially as women couldn't work for the church, so in no case could they ever claim it. Sanctuary was also another system from the church. If someone was on the run and they reached a church, they could claim sanctuary. This meant that they would be under the protection of the church, and even the sheriff or tithing couldn't remove them by force. Anyone could claim it. The clergy would report the crime, but then had to give them a chance to swear an oath, which meant that they would agree to leave the country rather than stand a trial. The criminal then had 40 days to either face a trial or to leave the country. Those who chose to leave would travel barefoot, carrying a wooden cross, and board the first ship from the country. However, some people never left the country and simply became outlaws. This meant that they had no protection from the court system. This system continued until 1536, during the reign of Henry VIII, when it was finally ended. Church courts. These were introduced to England by William the Conqueror, and these were firstly to deal with moral crimes such as failure to attend church, drunkenness, and playing football on a Sunday. Also, any churchman accused of a crime was tried in its own church courts, once they had read Psalm 51. Church courts never sentenced people to death, no matter how serious the crime was. And this was because the church wanted to offer a way for criminals to reform. The church believed that punishments motivated only by retribution were wrong. They believed that corporal punishment was better than capital punishment, because at least it gave a way for criminals to think about their actions and change their behaviour. Kings, however, preferred harsher punishments. This was unfair again, as no women or non-churchmen could be tried by them. Henry II was a king who had a massive impact on medieval justice at this time. He became king after 19 years of civil war in 1154, and because England at that time was filled with lots of lawlessness, he made some important changes. In 1166 he reorganised the courts and he set up prisons for those who were accused and waiting for trial. These changes were known as the Assizes of Clarendon. Henry ordered royal judges, known as justices in Eyre, to visit each country twice a year to hear the most serious criminal cases. The Constitutions of Clarendon. The power of the church brought the church and the king into conflict. Henry II particularly tried to limit the power of the church, as he thought that separate church courts challenged his authority as king, and it also undermined the more standardised system that he wanted to create throughout England, which would lead to more equality. So the king and the bishops met at the Council of Clarendon, as he wanted a clear statement of the relationship between church laws and king's laws. These were called the Constitutions of Clarendon. Henry challenged the benefit of the clergy and sanctuary. This was a new challenge to the church. The church courts rarely used the death penalty, so were more lenient. Punishments could include things such as pilgrimages, confessions, or apologies at Mass. This conflict between Henry and the church led to the murder of Thomas Becket over authority in 1170. Henry II and Thomas had fallen out over the power of the church courts, as Henry thought that criminals got off too lightly. After Becket was brutally slain, Henry had to seek the church's forgiveness. This increased the role of the king in legal matters. Henry led England to a more centralised control over the court system. He was also responsible for standard written instructions which were issued to local sheriffs. Under Henry II, the system was becoming more uniform across the country. So, other examples of change and continuity. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the growth in towns, for example London with 30,000 and York with 11,000, meant that there were more opportunities for crime than there had been in small villages. This meant that crime needed to be controlled more centrally. It now also meant that less locals were dealing with crime, and it was more down to government-appointed officials. This led to similar law enforcement methods used in different areas. Local townspeople still had to play their part in apprehending offenders, though towns were divided into wards for this purpose. For less serious crimes, such as disputes between the lord of the manor and local people, Manocourts from Anglo-Saxon times were still used. For example, for someone failing to carry out their duties for the lord of the manor. Tithing men now also became known as constables. There were also a couple of new laws, for example, the Statute of Labourers. This made it a crime to ask for higher wages. The reason for this is that during the period of the Black Death, about 1/3 of the population had died. This meant that with less workers, peasants could ask for higher wages for the jobs that they did. However, a consequence of this was that ruling classes were starting to worry about peasants becoming wealthier and, as a result, more powerful. They also didn't want to pay higher wages, and so this new law, the Statute of Labourers, was brought in by King Richard II to protect them. There was also the new law of heresy. New heresy laws were made where people would be punished for disagreeing with the teachings of the Church. Due to the rise in Islam in Asia and Africa, the Church became stricter, and so during this period, anyone who disagreed with the teachings of the Church could be accused of heresy. The punishment for this was burning at the stake, which was meant to purify the soul. So the sort of question that you could be asked is explain why the Church was a hindrance to justice in the Middle Ages. This would be a 12-mark question. The first thing you would need to do for your first paragraph and all subsequent ones is to make sure that you have an opening sentence which addresses the question. Then you need to have your evidence which is following the points with precise detail. And then you need to make sure that you explain. By doing this, you need to say how your evidence refers to the original point and question and proves your argument. So for in this case, if we're looking at explain why the Church was a hindrance to justice in the Middle Ages, you could start off with your first point saying, arguably the Church was a hindrance to justice in the Middle Ages as a result of the sanctuary it provided potential criminals. Now I would need to make sure that I used evidence to support this. So I could say, people accused of a crime could seek shelter in churches. They would then have the option to leave the country or face a trial in a church court. For example, a murderer could hide in a church for 40 days, then carry a cross barefoot to their local port and leave England. Lastly, I would then need to explain how it answered the points that I was making. So I could say, therefore the Church was a hindrance to justice in the Middle Ages, as potential criminals could escape punishment by hiding in the church, then leave the country or be trialled in a church court, which was a lot more favourable. Once you've done this, you would then repeat this 2 more times about different aspects. So for example, you could talk about the benefit of the clergy or the church courts. Thank you for watching. This is C.L. Barber, 1977.